Gunshots cracked through the Montana dawn like splitting the narrow canyon where blood would soon freeze on ancient rock. A woman in a torn dress steadied her rifle with hands that no longer trembled. Behind her lay months of deception. Ahead waited men who collected dead wives like mining claims and considered her their next acquisition. She'd come west as prey, a quiet librarian fleeing small-town corruption, answering a stranger's promise of marriage and prosperity. What she'd found instead was a network of killers who specialized in lonely women with modest fortunes and trusting hearts. Women who disappeared into unmarked graves after signing over their inheritances. But predators make one fatal mistake: they assume silence means weakness. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and winter pine as four armed men rode toward what they believed would be easy money. They had hunted her across 2,000 miles of frontier, expecting to find a frightened victim. Instead, they discovered something far more dangerous, a woman who'd learned that survival demands becoming the storm others never see coming. The reckoning had arrived. The investigation. Clara Whitmore had always possessed an uncanny ability to read between the lines, a skill that served her well during her 7 years managing the Millfield Public Library. But on this particular October evening in 1876, as she crouched behind the mahogany filing cabinets in Town Councilman Theodore Pike's office, that same skill was about to save her livelihood. The flickering gaslight cast dancing shadows across the scattered papers on his desk, each document a piece of the puzzle she'd been assembling for weeks. Pike had been suspiciously eager to replace her with his niece from Hartford, citing Clara's insufficient community engagement as justification. But Clara had noticed the timing, how Pike's sudden criticism coincided with his acquisition of valuable waterfront property, how his meetings with Eastern investors grew more frequent, how his wife suddenly sported expensive jewelry on a councilman's modest salary. The door creaked open. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as Pike's heavy footsteps approached his desk. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, grateful for the dark wool dress that helped her blend into the furniture. Through the gap between filing cabinets, she watched Pike unlock a drawer and withdraw a leather portfolio. Her breath caught as she glimpsed the documents inside bank drafts from the Hartford Development Company correspondence about expediting the library modernization project, and most damning of all, promissory note bearing Pike's signature for a sum that exceeded his annual salary tenfold. The Whitmore problem will be resolved by month's end, Pike muttered to someone Clara couldn't see. My niece has already agreed to the position. The library board won't question a unanimous council recommendation. Clara's hands clenched into fists. She'd suspected corruption, but hearing her life dismissed as merely a problem ignited something fierce within her normally reserved nature. As Pike and his companion exited, Clara carefully photographed the documents with her mind. Her librarian's training had taught her to memorize crucial details with photographic precision. The next morning, Clara didn't wait for Pike to strike first. She marched into editor Samuel Morrison's newspaper office with her findings meticulously documented. Morrison, a gruff Civil War veteran with ink-stained fingers and a nose for scandal, listened intently as Clara laid out the evidence. "You're certain about these figures?" he asked, studying her handwritten notes. "Theodore Pike has been stealing from the Town Improvement Fund to finance his land speculation." Clara nodded firmly. "The mathematics don't lie, Mr. Morrison, and neither do the signatures I witnessed." Morrison's eyes gleamed with the prospect of exposing municipal corruption. "Miss Whitmore, if you are willing to go on record, we can destroy Pike's career. But understand, he won't go down without a fight. Are you prepared for that war?" Clara straightened her shoulders, thinking of her mother's legacy in that library of the generations of Millfield children who'd learned to read among those shelves. "I've been preparing for this fight longer than I realized," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremors in her hands. That afternoon, Morrison's exposé hit the streets like a thunderclap. By evening, Pike was demanding Clara's immediate termination, threatening lawsuits and calling emergency council meetings. But Clara had anticipated his response. She'd already submitted resignation letters to 3 different newspapers, ensuring her story would spread beyond Pike's political reach. More importantly, she'd begun corresponding with a man named Jonas Crane in Montana Territory, a correspondence that had started weeks earlier when she'd first sensed her position becoming precarious. Jonas's letters painted an enticing picture of prosperity in the Western Territories. He described vast silver mining operations, a comfortable ranch house overlooking fertile valleys, and most appealingly, a place where a woman's intelligence and organizational skills were valued above her social connections. His proposal of marriage had arrived at the perfect moment when Clara needed an escape route that didn't feel like surrender. As Pike's threats escalated and his political allies closed ranks, Clara made her decision. She would leave Millfield not as a defeated librarian fleeing scandal, but as a woman choosing her own destiny. The West, with all its dangers and possibilities, beckoned like a challenging book she was eager to read. Journey West and the Train Robbery. The Union Pacific's westbound cars swayed rhythmically as they carried Clara deeper into America's heartland, each mile separating her from Theodore Pike's vendetta and toward an uncertain future in Montana Territory. She'd spent her savings on a first-class ticket, partly for comfort during the grueling journey, but mostly to observe the cross-section of American society traveling west. Wealthy industrialists discussed mining investments over imported cigars, while immigrant families clutched their few possessions and spoke in hushed foreign tongues about promised opportunities. Clara cataloged these human stories with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to library acquisitions, sensing that understanding people might prove more valuable than understanding books in her new life. The robbery came without warning on their third day out somewhere in the rolling Nebraska grasslands, where civilization thinned to scattered homesteads in endless sky. Clara was reviewing Jonas's letters when gunshots cracked like thunder outside her window. The train lurched to a grinding halt, metal wheels screaming against iron rails as passengers tumbled from their seats. Through the dust-caked glass, she saw four mounted figures approaching the passenger car's bandanas masking their faces, rifles gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Everyone out!" shouted the apparent leader, a lean man with cold eyes visible above his makeshift mask. "Hands where we can see them, and nobody gets hurt." As passengers stumbled onto the prairie, Clara's mind raced through possibilities. These weren't desperate amateurs. Their movements were too coordinated, their positions too strategic. They'd chosen this location carefully, far from any settlement that might offer assistance. The wealthy passengers were herded together while the bandits began systematically searching luggage and demanding valuables. Clara watched an elderly industrialist reluctantly surrender a leather pouch containing what looked like gold coins, saw a young mother clutch her crying infant while surrendering her wedding ring. That's when Clara spotted something that chilled her blood. One of the bandits wore expensive boots, the kind that cost more than a working man's monthly wages. "You there, the librarian lady," the leader called, fixing his attention on Clara. Her blood froze. How could he possibly know her profession? "I hear tell you've got a sharp eye for valuable things. Help us locate any hidden valuables, and maybe we don't search every lady passenger quite so thoroughly." Clara's mind clicked into place like a well-oiled mechanism. This wasn't random somehow, they knew about her. Perhaps Pike's corruption extended further than she'd imagined, or perhaps word of her investigation had reached the wrong ears. Either way, these men expected her to be useful to them. Clara stepped forward with apparent cooperation, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I'd be happy to assist, gentlemen. As a librarian, I do have experience identifying valuable items." She moved slowly among the passengers, pretending to assess their possessions while actually memorizing faces and details. When she reached the industrialist, she whispered urgently, "Your money belt, remove it now and give it to me." His eyes widened in confusion, but something in her tone compelled obedience. Clara then approached the bandit leader with feigned helpfulness. "Sir, I believe this gentleman was attempting to conceal additional funds." She handed over the industrialist's empty money belt while secretly directing the man to step behind a large woman whose voluminous skirts provided concealment. The distraction worked perfectly. While the bandits focused on the decoy belt, Clara signaled other passengers to similarly conceal their valuables. She guided a young woman to hide her jewelry in her infant's diaper, helped an elderly man slip his pocket watch into a flour sack someone had dropped. Her actions appeared cooperative to the bandits, while actually protecting the passengers' most precious possessions. When the leader grew suspicious of the meager haul, Clara boldly suggested, "Perhaps the real valuables are in the cargo car. That's where the mining equipment and bank transfers would be stored." Her knowledge of frontier commerce gleaned from Jonas's letters lent credibility to the misdirection. As the bandits moved toward the cargo car, Clara organized a quiet resistance among the passengers. Using hand signals and whispered instructions, she coordinated their movements like a skilled conductor directing an orchestra. When the bandits returned empty-handed and increasingly frustrated, they found their captives had somehow become a unified group rather than a collection of terrified individuals. The robbery ultimately netted far less than the bandits had planned, and their leader's parting glare at Clara suggested he suspected her role in their disappointment. As the train resumed its westward journey, Clara Barra realized she'd discovered something about herself when others needed protection. Her natural reserve transformed into decisive leadership. It was a revelation that would prove crucial in the challenges ahead. Arrival and early suspicions. Helena, Montana territory erupted around Clara like a barely controlled explosion of commerce and chaos. The train platform swarmed with miners heading to claims ranchers seeking supplies and entrepreneurs chasing rumors of easy wealth. The air carried a mixture of wood smoke, horse's sweat, and the metallic tang of silver dust from the nearby smelters. Clara stepped onto the wooden planks with her single trunk, scanning the crowd for Jonas Crane's promised familiar face. According to his final letter, he would meet her at the station wearing a brown hat with a distinctive silver band, a detail that had seemed charmingly specific when she'd read it in Connecticut, but now felt frustratingly vague among dozens of men in brown hats. An hour passed, then two. As the platform emptied and shadows lengthened, Clara's confidence began eroding like riverbank soil in spring floods. She'd sent Jonas her exact arrival details weeks ago, had received his confirmation just before departing Millfield. Yet here she sat on her trunk like an abandoned package, watching the sun sink toward the jagged mountain peaks that surrounded Helena like the walls of a vast amphitheater. A kindly station agent finally approached, his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss, you've been waiting here quite a spell. You got someone coming for you." Clara showed him Jonas's letter, and the man's expression grew troubled. "Don't know any Jonas Crane personally, but I heard tell there was some trouble out at the silver mines near Butte. Might be your fellow got delayed." Clara secured lodging at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, a clean establishment that catered to respectable women traveling alone. That evening, she began her investigation with characteristic thoroughness. Mrs. Patterson, a robust widow with graying hair and sharp eyes, proved to be a repository of local knowledge. Jonas Crane, she mused over evening tea. Name sounds familiar, but I can't place him exactly. Tell me, dear, what did he say about his circumstances? Clara shared details from Jonas's letters, his silver mining investments, his comfortable ranch, his desire for an educated wife to help manage his growing enterprises. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew increasingly skeptical. Mining's a risky business even for established operations, and ranching this far north requires considerable capital and experience. The next morning, Clara visited Helena's business district with a list of questions. At the mining claims office, she discovered that Jonas Crane held papers on 3 different silver prospects, but none had produced significant ore in over 6 months. The clerk, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers, confided that Crane owed substantial fees and hadn't been seen in town for weeks. At the bank, Clara learned that Jonas's accounts showed a pattern of increasingly desperate borrowing against properties of questionable value. "Miss, I probably shouldn't be telling you this," the bank manager whispered, "but if you are considering any business dealings with Mr. Crane, I'd advise extreme caution." Clara's investigation deepened at the territorial courthouse, where property records revealed a disturbing picture. Jonas had purchased his ranch just 8 months earlier using promissory notes backed by his mining claims. The previous owner had sold quickly, citing unforeseen complications with local water rights and Indian treaty boundaries. Most troubling of all, Clara discovered that Jonas had been married before to a young woman named Sarah Whitman, who died under mysterious circumstances the previous winter. The death certificate listed accidental poisoning, but the clerk's nervous demeanor suggested local suspicions ran deeper. That evening, Clara composed a carefully worded telegram to Editor Morrison back in Millfield, requesting he investigate Jonas Crane's background in Pennsylvania mining circles. While waiting for his response, she expanded her local inquiries. At the livery stable, she learned that Jonas's horse and wagon had been sold to cover debts 3 weeks ago. At the general store, she discovered he'd been purchasing unusual quantities of rat poison and medicinal compounds. Each revelation painted a more disturbing portrait of the man who'd courted her across 2,000 miles of correspondence. Clara realized she wasn't just dealing with a delayed fiancé, she was uncovering evidence of a systematic deceiver whose previous wife had died under suspicious circumstances. The pattern emerging from her investigation suggested Jonas Crane was a predator who targeted educated, independent women through carefully crafted correspondence. His letters to Clara had emphasized her intelligence and self-reliance qualities that would make her valuable in business dealings, but also potentially threatening if she discovered his true nature. As Clara sat in her boarding house room that night, studying her notes by lamplight, she felt the familiar thrill of solving a complex puzzle. But this time the stakes weren't a corrupt councilman's career, they were her life and safety. She was beginning to understand that her journey to Montana might not lead to marriage and prosperity, but to a confrontation with a dangerous man who collected wives like mining claims, extracting value until the vein ran dry. Malcolm's Ranch and Hidden Connections. Malcolm Sterling's ranch sprawled across the Broken Creek Valley like a small kingdom carved from wilderness and willpower. When Clara first glimpsed it from the wagon seat beside Mrs. Patterson, who'd insisted on making the introduction personally, she counted at least 200 head of cattle grazing in fenced pastures that stretched toward Purple Mountains. The main house, built from local timber and stone, spoke of prosperity earned through years of careful planning rather than quick speculation. Outbuildings included a substantial barn bunkhouse, smokehouse, and workshop, all maintained with the methodical attention to detail that Clara recognized in fellow perfectionists. Malcolm himself proved to be a man of contradictions that immediately intrigued Clara's analytical mind. Tall and broad-shouldered, with premature silver threading through dark hair and steady gray eyes that seemed to weigh every word before speaking, he moved with the fluid confidence of someone completely at home in his environment. Yet when Mrs. Patterson explained Clara's situation, stranded by a missing fiancé seeking temporary employment, Malcolm's reaction suggested he knew more about Jonas Crane than he initially admitted. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "I'd be happy to offer you a position managing my household accounts and correspondence. The work would include overseeing domestic staff, maintaining business records, and assisting with ranch operations as needed." The offer came too quickly, too conveniently, for Clara's suspicious nature. During her first week at Broken Creek Ranch, she applied the same investigative skills that had exposed Theodore Pike's corruption to understanding Malcolm's operation. His business records were meticulously maintained, showing steady profits from cattle sales, land leases, and what appeared to be wise investments in mining equipment rental. Yet Clara noticed gaps, periods where significant funds had been withdrawn without corresponding documentation. Correspondence files with missing letters, and most intriguingly, a locked drawer in Malcolm's office desk that he claimed contained personal papers. Clara's opportunity came when Malcolm traveled to Helena for a cattle buyers meeting, leaving her alone with his sister Rebecca. Rebecca Sterling was a woman of perhaps 35, unmarried, with prematurely graying hair and intelligent eyes that held depths of unspoken sadness. Unlike many frontier women, Rebecca had maintained Eastern refinements. She read voraciously, corresponded with friends in distant cities, and possessed an educated woman's perspective on current events. Over evening tea, Rebecca gradually revealed family history that cast Malcolm's prosperity in a different light. "My brother wasn't always a rancher," Rebecca confided as they sat before the stone fireplace, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before he came west, Malcolm was a mining engineer in Pennsylvania. He specialized in silver extraction techniques, worked for several companies that developed new territories." Clara's blood chilled as connections began forming in her mind. Rebecca continued, apparently unaware of the implications. "Malcolm left Pennsylvania rather suddenly in 1874. There was some trouble with a mining investment, a partner who disappeared with company funds. Malcolm lost everything and came west to start over." Clara spent the next several days discreetly examining Malcolm's locked drawer, finally managing to open it with a hairpin technique she'd learned from a dime novel. Inside, she discovered correspondence that confirmed her worst suspicions. Letters from Jonas Crane, dated over 2 years earlier, addressed Malcolm as partner and discussed their joint investment in Montana silver prospects. The partnership had dissolved acrimoniously, with Jonas apparently cheating Malcolm out of substantial funds before disappearing. Most damning was a newspaper clipping from a Pennsylvania mining journal describing the suspicious death of Jonas's first wife and subsequent investigation that had been mysteriously dropped when key witnesses recanted their testimony. That evening, when Malcolm returned from Helena, Clara confronted him directly. She'd learned that subtle approaches rarely worked with strong-willed men, and Malcolm's immediate defensive reaction confirmed her suspicions. "You knew Jonas Crane before I arrived," she stated, not asking. "You were business partners, and he betrayed you just as he's apparently betrayed me." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny the accusation. Instead, he poured himself a whiskey and stood with his back to her, staring out at the darkening valley. "Jonas Crane is a dangerous man, Miss Whitmore. When I learned he was expecting a mail-order bride, I hoped to warn you before you became his next victim. By offering me employment without explaining our connection," Clara's voice carried steel beneath its surface calm. "By keeping me here under false pretenses while my fiancé remains missing." Malcolm turned to face her, and she saw genuine anguish in his expression. "Because Jonas isn't missing Clara. He's dead. I killed him 3 weeks ago when he came here demanding his share of ranch profits he had no legal claim to." The confession hung between them like a loaded rifle. Malcolm continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his admission. "Jonas drew on me first. It was self-defense, but proving that to a territorial judge would be complicated, especially given our history. I buried him in the north pasture and told myself I was protecting other women from his schemes." Clara felt the world shift beneath her feet. She'd come west to escape one form of corruption, only to find herself in the midst of something far more dangerous. Yet, as she studied Malcolm's face in the lamplight, she saw not the cold calculation of a murderer, but the exhausted relief of a man who'd carried a terrible burden alone. "Show me," she said quietly. "Show me where you buried him, and tell me everything that happened. If I'm to stay here, I need to know the complete truth." It was a decision that would bind their fates together in ways neither could yet imagine, but Clara had learned that facing dangerous truths was preferable to living comfortable lies. Rebecca's secret and the sisterhood. Rebecca Sterling's revelation came during a November blizzard that trapped Clara inside the ranch house for 3 days, creating an intimate atmosphere where long-held secrets finally demanded voice. Clara had been organizing Malcolm's business correspondence when she noticed Rebecca standing in the doorway, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. "There's something else you need to know about Jonas Crane," Rebecca said, her voice barely audible above the wind howling around the eaves. "Something Malcolm doesn't know, and something that changes everything about why Jonas came here." Over the next several hours, as snow piled against the windows and the fire crackled in the stone hearth, Rebecca unfolded a story that revealed the true scope of Jonas's predatory nature. 2 years earlier, while visiting friends in Denver, Rebecca had met a charming gentleman named Jonathan Carver, who spoke eloquently about silver mining opportunities and the bright future of the Montana Territory. Their courtship had been brief but intense. Jonathan possessed an uncanny ability to identify exactly what Rebecca needed to hear about her intelligence, her capabilities, her worthiness of love, despite her unmarried status. "He proposed after only 3 weeks," Rebecca continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Said he owned a profitable mine near Helena and wanted an educated wife to help manage his expanding business interests. I was 33 years old, Clara, and I thought this might be my only chance for marriage and children." Rebecca had accepted eagerly, using her inheritance to fund Jonathan's mining equipment purchases and operational expenses. They'd planned to marry in Montana, where she would help establish their new enterprise. Clara felt sick recognition building in her stomach as Rebecca's story paralleled her own experience with devastating precision. "The mine didn't exist, did it?" she asked gently. Rebecca shook her head, tears beginning to flow. "Worse than that, when I arrived in Helena, I discovered that Jonathan Carver was actually Jonas Crane, and I wasn't his first victim. There was Sarah Whitman, whose death I'd heard whispered about, and before her a woman named Mary Sullivan, who disappeared entirely after transferring her property to Jonas's name." Rebecca's voice grew stronger as she described her growing awareness of Jonas's pattern. He specifically targeted educated, independent women with modest inheritances or business skills. Women who could contribute financially to his schemes while also providing domestic stability and social respectability. But once he'd extracted maximum value, he disposed of them through suspicious accidents, mysterious disappearances, or simply abandonment in remote locations where survival was unlikely. The revelation that shattered Clara's remaining illusions came when Rebecca explained how she'd escaped Jonas's trap. I discovered his true identity purely by accident when a merchant in Helena recognized me as Jonas Crane's woman rather than Jonathan Carver's fiancée. That night, I confronted him with my knowledge. Rebecca's voice dropped to a whisper. He didn't deny anything. Instead, he laughed and told me I was too clever, for my own good, just like Sarah Whitman had been. He said he'd enjoyed the challenge of deceiving an educated woman, but that I'd outlived my usefulness. How did you escape? Clara asked, though she suspected the answer would reveal depths of trauma that Rebecca had been carrying alone. Rebecca's composure finally cracked as she described fleeing Jonas's hotel room in the middle of the night, using her remaining funds to hire protection from a group of traveling merchants who agreed to escort her back to Malcolm's ranch. But Jonas followed me, she whispered. He came here 6 months later, claiming I owed him compensation for the business opportunities I'd ruined by leaving. Malcolm threw him off the property, but Jonas threatened to return and take what he considered his by force. Clara now understood why Malcolm had killed Jonas with such finality and why Rebecca lived in constant fear despite her brother's protection. Jonas Crane wasn't just a swindler or even a murderer. He was a predator who viewed women as resources to be exploited and discarded. The three women he'd targeted shared similar characteristics: intelligence, independence, and the kind of quiet strength that made them both valuable and threatening to a man who needed to maintain complete control. That night, as the blizzard continued to rage outside Clara and Rebecca sat up planning what they would do with this knowledge. They couldn't bring Jonas back to face justice, but they could protect other women from similar predators. Clara suggested they compile a detailed record of Jonas's methods, his aliases, and his pattern of targeting specific types of women. We'll send warnings to postmasters in major cities, Clara proposed. Create a network of information that might save other women from our experience. Rebecca agreed eagerly, and Clara realized that their shared trauma had forged a bond stronger than friendship. They had become sisters in survival, united by their determination to transform victimization into protection for others. The mining conspiracy unveiled. Clara's discovery of the hidden mine began with a mundane task: organizing Malcolm's geological survey, maps to prepare for spring cattle rotation planning. As she spread the detailed topographical drawings across his office table, her librarian's eye for patterns identified something that shouldn't have been there: a network of underground passages that extended far beyond anything necessary for water wells or root cellars. The maps showed a sophisticated mining operation carved into the hillside behind the ranch's north pasture, the same area where Malcolm claimed to have buried Jonas Crane. When Malcolm returned from checking fence lines that evening, Clara confronted him with the maps spread before her like evidence in a trial. "There's a silver mine on your property," she stated, watching his face carefully for tells. "A substantial operation, judging by these survey markings. And I suspect Jonas Crane knew about it, which is why he really came here." Malcolm's expression shifted from surprise to resignation as he realized his carefully constructed version of events was crumbling under Clara's methodical investigation. "The mine was here when I bought the property," Malcolm admitted, settling into his chair with the weariness of a man who'd carried too many secrets for too long. "The previous owner, Samuel Morrison, no relation to your newspaper friend, had been working it quietly for 2 years. He discovered a rich vein, but lacked the capital to extract it properly. That's where Jonas and I came in with our Pennsylvania mining expertise and Eastern investors." Clara listened intently as Malcolm described their original partnership, which had seemed legitimate and potentially profitable for all involved. The partnership had soured when Jonas began pressuring Morrison to sell them complete ownership rather than maintaining their agreed-upon partnership percentage. Jonas could be very persuasive when he wanted something. Malcolm explained, his voice dark with memory. He convinced Morrison that territorial law changes might invalidate his mining rights unless he had more capital and political connections. Morrison was elderly, worried about Indian treaty complications, and Jonas exploited those fears ruthlessly. Within 6 months, Jonas had maneuvered Morrison into signing over complete ownership in exchange for what amounted to a token payment and vague promises of future profits. Clara's investigative insights immediately focused on the crucial question: what happened to Morrison? Malcolm's silence stretched long enough to confirm her suspicions before he answered. "Morrison died of food poisoning less than a week after signing the ownership transfer. Jonas claimed it was spoiled beef, But Morrison had been healthy as a horse despite his 73 years. The implication hung between them like a loaded gun. Clara realized she was looking at evidence of murder, not the self-defense killing Malcolm had described, but a calculated elimination of an inconvenient witness. Jonas didn't come here seeking revenge or partnership profits, Clara said, pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. He came here because this mine is producing silver and he believed he still had legal claim to ownership. Malcolm nodded grimly. The vein Morrison found extends deeper than anyone imagined. Conservative estimates suggest enough silver to make whoever controls it wealthy for decades. Jonas had gambling debts in Denver, owed money to dangerous people, and needed his share of mine profits to stay alive. Malcolm led Clara through the ranch house basement to a concealed entrance that opened into the mine complex. The scale of the operation stunned her. This wasn't a simple prospector's hole, but a sophisticated mining enterprise with proper ventilation, reinforced passages, and machinery for extracting and processing ore. "I've been working it alone since Morrison died," Malcolm explained, gesturing toward piles of raw silver ore waiting for transport, using Rebecca's inheritance and the ranch profits to fund equipment and cover operational costs. "I plan to eventually bring in partners, but Jonas's arrival complicated everything." Clara understood now why Malcolm had been so quick to offer her employment, why he'd been secretive about certain aspects of his business, and why Jonas's death had been necessary rather than optional. "You're not just a rancher," she said, studying Malcolm's face in the lamplight filtering down from above. "You're sitting on one of the richest silver deposits in Montana territory, and Jonas Crane was the one person who could legally challenge your ownership." Malcolm's expression confirmed her assessment. "And now you're the only person alive who knows the complete truth about this operation, Clara. That makes you either my most trusted partner or my most dangerous liability." The choice he presented wasn't really a choice at all, but Clara had expected this moment since discovering the first inconsistencies in Malcolm's story. She was too smart, too thorough, and too persistent to remain safely ignorant. "I choose partnership," she said firmly, "but I have conditions. First, we document everything: Morrison's death, Jonas's schemes, the mine's potential output. Second, we establish legal protections for Rebecca and any other workers. And third, we create a plan for what happens if other people discover this operation." Malcolm extended his hand and Clara shook it, sealing an alliance that would transform her from a stranded mail-order bride into one of the wealthiest women in Montana territory if they could survive the challenges that lay ahead. Preparing for Battle Winter's grip on the Broken Creek Valley provided both protection and deadline for Clara and Malcolm's preparations. The mountain passes would remain impassable until late spring, giving them several months to fortify their position before outside threats could materialize. But Clara's experience with corruption in Millfield had taught her that dangerous men rarely worked alone, and Jonas Crane's network of criminal associates would eventually come looking for their missing partner and his promised silver mine shares. Clara approached their defensive planning with the same methodical thoroughness she'd applied to library administration, creating detailed inventories of resources, potential threats, and strategic options. She cataloged the ranch's weapons Malcolm owned, several rifles, a shotgun, and adequate ammunition, while Rebecca proved surprisingly knowledgeable about firearms maintenance and marksmanship. "Frontier women learn to shoot straight or die young," Rebecca explained matter-of-factly, while cleaning a Winchester rifle with practiced efficiency. "Malcolm taught me years ago, but I've kept up my skills hunting game for our table." Their first major preparation involved securing the mine operation itself. Malcolm and Clara spent long December days creating multiple concealed entrances, installing heavy timber reinforcements, and establishing emergency supply caches throughout the underground complex. Clara insisted on mapping every passage and creating detailed evacuation plans, understanding that the mine could become either their greatest asset or their final trap depending on circumstances. "We need to think like generals preparing for siege," she told Malcolm as they worked by lantern light in the deepest tunnels. "Every advantage we create now might mean the difference between survival and disaster." Clara's most crucial contribution was establishing communication networks that could summon help or spread warnings as needed. Drawing on her correspondence skills, she cultivated relationships with other ranch families in the valley, the territorial marshal's office in Helena, and even Editor Morrison back in Millfield. Each contact received carefully crafted letters that provided partial information enough to establish Clara's credibility and location without revealing the mine's existence or the circumstances of Jonas's death. Information is our most powerful weapon, she explained to Rebecca while composing their latest batch of strategic correspondence. The right message to the right person at the right time could save our lives. Rebecca emerged as an unexpected asset in their planning process. Her traumatic experience with Jonas had left her hypervigilant about potential threats, but it had also taught her to read people with devastating accuracy. Jonas often mentioned his associates in Denver, she told Clara during one of their evening strategy sessions, men who'd invested in his various schemes and expected returns on their money. He specifically mentioned someone called Blackjack Morrison, apparently a gambler and enforcer who'd backed several of Jonas's mining ventures. The name sent chills through Clara's blood, both because of its implications and because it shared a surname with her newspaper ally back east. By February, their preparations had transformed the ranch into a subtle fortress. Fence lines had been reinforced and repositioned to provide better defensive positions while appearing to serve legitimate ranching purposes. The main house basement now contained emergency supplies, medical equipment, and enough ammunition to withstand a substantial assault. Most importantly, Clara had established contingency plans for various scenarios, from territorial law enforcement investigations to outright attacks by Jonas's criminal associates. Their planning proved prescient when the first test came in early March. A traveling merchant brought news that strangers had been asking questions about Jonas Crane in Helena's saloons, offering rewards for information about his whereabouts and business activities. 3 men, maybe 4, the merchant reported, accepting Rebecca's offer of coffee and warm food. Well-dressed but hard-looking, if you catch my meaning. The kind of fellows who solve problems with lead rather than lawyers. Clara and Malcolm exchanged glances that confirmed their shared understanding Jonas's criminal partners had finally begun their search. That night, Clara made a decision that would define everything that followed. "We don't wait for them to find us," she announced. The 3 sat around the kitchen table planning their response. "We take the fight to them on our terms, at a time and place of our choosing." Malcolm started to object, but Clara continued, with quiet intensity. "I've learned that defensive thinking leads to defensive outcomes. These men expect to find a missing partner in an isolated ranch family. Instead, they're going to encounter something they never anticipated: a woman who's tired of being underestimated." Rebecca nodded agreement, her own determination hardened by months of living in fear. The transformation was complete. Clara Whitmore, former librarian, had evolved into a frontier strategist, preparing for war. The trap is set. Clara's plan unfolded with the precision of a well-orchestrated symphony, each element designed to exploit her opponent's assumptions about frontier women and isolated ranches. She began by spreading carefully crafted rumors through Helena's merchant network, establishing a fictional narrative about the ranch's inhabitants, a widow named Clara Sterling, using the Malcolm surname, who'd inherited property after her husband's mining accident, and assisted by her brother-in-law Malcolm and his traumatized sister Rebecca. The story painted them as vulnerable but potentially wealthy, exactly the kind of targets that would attract Jonas's criminal associates while underestimating their actual capabilities. Through the merchant who'd brought news of the stranger's inquiries, Clara leaked information about a substantial silver discovery on the ranch property. She even provided a rough map showing the mine's location, but one that deliberately led to a carefully prepared killing ground rather than the actual operation. Men like Jonas's partners think with their greed first and their brains second, she explained to Malcolm, as they positioned supplies in their chosen ambush site, a narrow canyon that provided perfect concealment while offering limited escape routes for anyone who entered. They'll see an opportunity to claim a rich mine from a defenseless widow, and they won't look too carefully at the details. The bait proved irresistible. Within 2 weeks, the strangers had purchased supplies in Helena and hired a local guide to lead them to the Broken Creek Valley. Clara's network of merchant contacts kept her informed of their movements, their equipment purchases, and most crucially, their assumption that they were dealing with typical frontier settlers rather than prepared adversaries. 4 men heavily armed, carrying mining equipment and legal documents, reported Samuel Hayes, a freight operator who'd become one of Clara's most reliable sources. "They're planning to arrive at your ranch tomorrow afternoon, claiming legal right to inspect Jonas Crane's mining investments. Clara spent the final night before the confrontation writing detailed letters to be sent in case she didn't survive. One went to editor Morrison in Millfield, containing complete documentation of Theodore Pike's corruption, Jonas Crane's criminal activities, and the circumstances that had led her to Montana. Another went to the territorial marshal, providing evidence of Jonas's murders and the legal claims that might arise from his criminal enterprises. If something happens to us, she told Rebecca while sealing the envelopes, these letters will ensure the truth survives even if we don't. The morning of March 15th dawned clear and cold, with late winter snow crunching underfoot as Clara, Malcolm, and Rebecca took their positions in the canyon. Clara had insisted on being the bait herself, understanding that the sight of a lone woman would draw their opponents into the most vulnerable position. She wore her best dress and carried herself with the nervous uncertainty of someone genuinely frightened, a performance that required no acting since she was genuinely terrified despite her outward confidence. Malcolm and Rebecca positioned themselves with clear fields of fire, their weapons loaded and ready. The strangers arrived exactly as Clara's information network had predicted, four hard-faced men in city clothes riding expensive horses and leading a pack mule loaded with mining equipment. Their leader, a tall man with silver-streaked beard and cold blue eyes, matched Rebecca's description of someone Jonas had called Blackjack Morrison. Clara felt bitter irony at sharing a surname with this criminal while hoping her ally, editor Morrison, might someday read about this confrontation in the territorial newspapers. Mrs. Sterling, I presume, Blackjack called as he approached Clara's position near the canyon mouth. We represent certain business interests that had agreements with Jonas Crane regarding mining operations on this property. We're here to conduct a legally authorized inspection of said operations. Clara played her role perfectly, showing them the false map with trembling hands, while explaining that she knew nothing about mining but desperately needed money to maintain the ranch. Blackjack's eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction as he studied the map, clearly believing he'd found exactly what he'd hoped for, a naive widow with valuable property and no protection. Lead the way, Mrs. Sterling, Blackjack ordered his companions, spreading out in what they assumed was a cautious formation. We'll need to examine this mine very carefully to determine its actual value. Clara guided them into the canyon, her heart pounding as she approached the moment when months of preparation would be tested in bloody reality. Behind her, four armed criminals followed confidently, expecting to claim a fortune. Ahead of her, Malcolm and Rebecca waited with their own weapons ready to transform hunters into prey. The quiet storm that had been building since Clara left Millfield was about to break with thunder and lightning, the final confrontation. The battle erupted with the sudden violence of a spring thunderstorm breaking over the mountains. Clara had led Blackjack Morrison and his three associates exactly where she wanted them, 30 yards into the narrow canyon, far enough from escape routes, but close enough for accurate shooting in the uncertain light of late afternoon. When she gave the signal by dropping her handkerchief, Malcolm and Rebecca opened fire simultaneously from their concealed positions among the rocky outcroppings, their first shots taking down two of the criminals before they could react. Blackjack proved why he'd survived years of frontier violence, throwing himself behind a fallen log while drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. "It's a trap," he shouted to his surviving companion, a lean man with a scarred face who'd managed to find cover behind a boulder. "The widow's got partners." Clara dove for the protection of a rock formation as bullets began ricocheting off stone surfaces around her, their sharp cracks echoing off canyon walls like deadly thunder. The careful positioning she'd planned with Malcolm suddenly became a matter of life and death as gun smoke began filling the confined space. "Clara Sterling, if that's even your real name," Blackjack called during a brief lull in the shooting. "Jonas told us all about you." "You're the librarian from Connecticut who got him killed." Clara's blood chilled at the revelation that Blackjack knew her true identity, but she also heard opportunity in his words. If he wanted to talk, it meant he was looking for advantages rather than simply trying to escape. "Jonas Crane was a murderer and a thief," she called back, keeping her voice steady despite the terror hammering in her chest. "How many women did he kill for their inheritance money?" The question triggered an unexpected response from Blackjack, whose laughter carried genuine amusement despite their deadly circumstances. "More than you'd believe, library lady Sarah Whitman, Mary Sullivan, that Denver banker's daughter, and probably a dozen others we never heard about. Jonas had a real talent for finding lonely women with money and convincing them to trust him. Clara felt sick fury at this casual catalog of murder, but she also recognized valuable intelligence. And you helped him, was she accused, trying to keep Black Jack talking while Malcolm and Rebecca maneuvered for better shooting positions. Helped him, Black Jack's voice carried mock indignation. We financed him. Jonas was our best investment. He'd identify wealthy targets, court them through letters, get them to wire money for his fake mining ventures, then eliminate them before they could cause problems. We split the profits 50-50, and everybody stayed happy, except the dead women. The casual brutality of his confession confirmed everything Clara had suspected about Jonas's criminal network, while revealing the true scope of their operation. The final phase of the battle began when Rebecca flanked the surviving criminals by working her way through a series of natural chimneys in the canyon wall, a route they'd scouted extensively during their preparations. Her first shot took Blackjack's companion in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the rocky ground. Malcolm used the distraction to advance on Blackjack's position, but the criminal leader proved he hadn't survived this long without considerable skill and luck. Blackjack's return fire drove Malcolm back into cover, while also revealing that he carried multiple weapons and considerable ammunition. "You killed my best earner, library lady," he shouted at Clara while reloading his revolver with practiced speed. "Jonas was worth a fortune in the right markets, and now you've cost me years of investment." Clara realized that Blackjack's fury was making him careless, exposing himself to longer shots as he tried to maintain covering fire in multiple directions. When he rose to change positions, Clara took careful aim with Malcolm's spare rifle and squeezed the trigger. Her shot took Blackjack Morrison in the chest, spinning him backward into the canyon wall where he slumped with blood spreading across his expensive vest. The wounded man tried to bring his weapon up for one final shot, but Rebecca's rifle cracked from above and Blackjack Morrison collapsed face first into the rocky dirt of the canyon floor. The sudden silence that followed felt almost as violent as the gunfire had been, broken only by the echo of the last shot fading among the stone walls and the ragged breathing of three survivors who'd just fought for their lives and won. Clara stood slowly from her cover rifle, still ready, surveying the aftermath of the most violent 15 minutes of her life. 4 bodies lay scattered across the canyon floor, their blood already beginning to freeze in the late afternoon cold. Malcolm emerged from his position with a shallow graze across his forehead, while Rebecca climbed down from her elevated shooting position, with smoke still rising from her rifle barrel. They'd survived, but Clara understood that this victory had transformed them irrevocably. They were no longer simply ranch residents hiding a secret, but killers who'd eliminated an entire criminal organization to protect their own lives and fortune. The new beginning. Spring came to Broken Creek Valley with unusual violence that year, as though nature itself was washing away the blood and secrets of the previous months. Clara stood on the ranch house porch, watching Malcolm and his newly hired crew prepare the south pasture for expanded cattle grazing their activities, masking the careful burial of 4 criminals whose disappearance would puzzle territorial law enforcement for years to come. The silver mine continued producing wealth beyond their most optimistic projections, but Clara had insisted on establishing legitimate business partnerships and proper legal documentation to ensure their prosperity couldn't be challenged by future Jonas Cranes. The transformation in Rebecca Sterling proved as dramatic as the changing season. No longer haunted by fears of Jonas's return or paralyzed by traumatic memories, she'd embraced her role as business partner with enthusiasm that reminded Clara of her own love for complex organizational challenges. Rebecca had proven herself in combat, demonstrated keen intelligence in their planning, and now applied those same qualities to establishing their mining operation as a respected territorial enterprise. "We're going to need a proper office in Helena," Rebecca announced over breakfast, studying the latest ore quality reports, "and eventually we'll need to consider railroad connections for shipping larger quantities." Clara's own evolution felt even more profound. The quiet librarian who'd fled Theodore Pike's corruption had discovered capabilities she'd never suspected developing, from a woman who avoided confrontation into someone who planned and executed deadly ambushes with methodical precision. Yet she'd retained the analytical skills and ethical compass that had always defined her character, ensuring their mining operation treated workers fairly and contributed positively to territorial development. "We have responsibilities that go beyond mere profit," she explained to Malcolm as they reviewed applications from prospective miners. This wealth gives us power, and power demands ethical use. Malcolm had proposed marriage in February, but Clara had insisted on waiting until after their confrontation with Blackjack Morrison's group. I needed to know who I really was, for I could promise to share that self with anyone, she'd explained, and Malcolm had accepted her reasoning with the patience that made their partnership work so well. Now, with spring bringing new possibilities and old threats eliminated, Clara found herself ready to embrace a future that included both business success and personal happiness. Their wedding took place in Helena on the first warm day of May, with territorial officials, business partners, and fellow ranchers witnessing the union of two people who'd forged their bond through shared dangers and mutual respect. Editor Morrison had traveled from Millfield to serve as Clara's witness, bringing news that Theodore Pike had been convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison. Your investigation saved Millfield from years of corruption, Morrison told Clara during the reception. The library board voted unanimously to name the new reading room in your honor. The Sterling Mining Company, as they'd named their legitimate enterprise, quickly became one of Montana Territory's most successful operations. Clara's organizational skills, Malcolm's mining expertise, and Rebecca's business acumen created a combination that attracted investment, respect, and political influence throughout the region. They employed over 50 workers, by autumn established the valley's first school, and funded construction of a proper church that served the growing community around their operations. Clara often thought about the mail-order bride advertisement that had brought her west, wondering what Jonas Crane had really expected to find in a Connecticut librarian. He'd sought someone intelligent enough to manage his affairs, but naive enough to be easily controlled, never imagining that those same intellectual qualities would make her capable of exposing his crimes and ultimately destroying his entire criminal network. The irony pleased her during quiet moments when she reviewed their business correspondence or planned new community improvements. As winter approached again, Clara stood in the mine office reviewing production reports that showed their operation had become one of the territory's largest silver producers. Through the window, she could see Malcolm working with their foreman to prepare equipment for winter storage, while Rebecca supervised the installation of new safety equipment in the deeper tunnels. The domestic scene felt almost surreal when she remembered the violence that had made it possible, but Clara had learned to live with moral complexity rather than seeking simple answers. The letter that arrived in November brought their story full circle in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. A woman named Elizabeth Warner wrote from Chicago explaining that she'd been corresponding with a gentleman named Jonas Crane about marriage and mining opportunities in Montana Territory. My friends warned me about answering such advertisements, Elizabeth wrote, but Mr. Crane's letters were so convincing, and he seemed to understand my desire for independence and meaningful work. Clara immediately recognized the pattern she'd once fallen victim to herself. Clara's response to Elizabeth Warner became the first of many such letters, as word spread through women's networks about the Sterling Mining Company's willingness to help other potential victims of marriage fraud. Rebecca suggested they establish a formal warning system using their business connections to identify and expose predators who targeted independent women through fraudulent correspondence. We survived Jonas Crane, Rebecca pointed out during one of their planning sessions. Now we have an obligation to ensure other women don't face similar dangers. By the end of their first year as legitimate business owners, Clara and Malcolm had created something unprecedented in frontier society, a mining operation that functioned as both commercial enterprise and social reform organization. They'd prospered beyond any of their original expectations while building a community that reflected their shared values of honesty, hard work, and mutual protection. The quiet storm that had carried Clara west from Connecticut had finally settled into something like peace, but a peace earned through courage, intelligence, and the willingness to fight for their own survival. Clara Whitmore Sterling closed her diary that December evening with a sense of completion that felt almost like contentment. She'd come west seeking escape from one form of corruption, only to encounter far more dangerous threats, but she'd also discovered strengths and capabilities that her previous life had never demanded. The frontier had tested her in ways that transformed a reserved librarian into a formidable woman of business and influence, proving that the quietest storms sometimes reshape the landscape most dramatically. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new responsibilities, but Clara faced them with the confidence of someone who'd already survived her worst nightmares and emerged stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. The silver mine still echoes with picks and shovels, but the ghosts have finally gone quiet. Clara Sterling stands where blood once stained froze in the ground, watching her workers prepare for another productive season. The woman who fled Connecticut as a desperate librarian now commands one of Montana's most respected mining operations. But prosperity came at a price measured in more than silver. 4 graves mark the cost of her transformation. A criminal network that preyed on trusting women lies buried in unmarked canyon soil. The quiet mouse who once cataloged books in peaceful library corners learned to plan ambushes with deadly precision. Some victories demand you become someone you never intended to be. Yet in building her empire from violence and betrayal, Clara created something unexpected, a refuge for other women targeted by predators who mistake gentleness for weakness. The Sterling Mining Company doesn't just extract silver from mountain stone, it transforms victims into survivors, prey into protectors. Sometimes the greatest strength comes wrapped in silence. Sometimes the most dangerous storms gather in hearts that have learned to weather too much pain. Clara's journey from mail-order bride to mining baroness proves that heroes aren't always the loudest voices in the room. They're the ones who stand firm when everything else falls apart. What storms have taught you who you really are?